talked about that you care what are you going over
I'll talk about it.
there?
All right, so on this video demonstration, we're going to be looking at exporting the model now. So we're going to do a little bit of final preparation for exporting it out of Blender to prep it for Augment so that it can be properly viewed in augmented reality. So there are some adjustments we need to change to the model at this stage. Now, when you do this step, I highly recommend that you probably work with like a duplicate of your Blender file to manage this part of the design process. Because part of what we'll do with this, everything at this step assumes that you are done creating your still image renders. You're not going to make any more of them. Because what we'll have to do is rotate our entire scene, reduce certain image elements, get rid of the cyclorama, lights, and so on to accomplish this final stage. So, first thing we need to know is to check our sculpture's overall dimensional area to give kind of an idea or to know the size of it proper for displaying an augment. So in the instructions, I give you like 2 different ways that you can do it. The first one you can do is adding like a simple cube to your screen. So I'm going to do this in quad view real quick, and I'm going to turn off my camera view. Exit that. And again, for this step, we're not sending the cyclorama. It's not going to be exported with your final model. This is why working with a duplicate of your Blender file at this stage will be important, because you'll want to get rid of your cyclorama from your design completely for this stage of the design process. So again, I'm going to come over here and just kind of work with this for a second. But I'm going to add a basic cube to my scene, and I'm just going to check for the overall dimensional space, what they also call the bounding box area for an entire design. So one thing you can do to understand what bounding box does, if you switch your viewport preview to bounding box, what this does is this converts every object or mesh element into an absolute dimensional box that would encase that item inside of like a perfect cube structure. So the body for my character fits perfectly inside of this box that shows its absolute boundaries, left and right, up and down, side to side. Now we need to know what our absolute bounding box is for our whole scene though, so that we know how Augment is going to read the center of the entire mesh area. So I'm going to add a cube to my scene. So there's my cube. And from here, I'm going to resize this cube to where it fits all of my object elements inside of it. Now I'm doing it in bounding box mode so that you can see, things. I'm going to actually go back to wireframe though. And what I'm going to do with this little box is I'm just going to be scaling it up using some of my different scaling tools to reshape the box to fit around my object. And so I'm using combinations of other transform controls to do that. Now you have to watch your own screen elements though. The more objects you have that build out your entire bust sculpture design area, excluding lights, cameras, and the cyclorama, are considered a part of your model. Okay, all that other stuff, lights, camera, cyclorama, we're going to get rid of in a minute. So don't try to think of those as part of what you need to fit inside of this box we're creating. So the only element that I have in my scene currently is my figure. And so I'm just scaling up this object that I'm working on to fit inside of each window to where it goes and extends only to the absolute dimensions of my character, or the edges of my character. So I am very carefully coming in, resizing, repositioning, and scaling this box down to fit. And it takes several times to do this, but this is important so you understand the overall size of your object's area. And so again, I'm looking very carefully. I'll even turn off my cyclorama and my empty box for a minute. And I'm just looking to see where the absolute wireframe of all of my sculpture surfaces are. And I'm trying to get them to all fit inside this cube neatly from each viewport. So the right side looks pretty good. The cube is fitting pretty well in there. I'm going to go to my front, and it's a little too wide. Needs to be flush right up against the outer outskirts of the model. So that's a little better now. We're trying to get it like close to accurate. It doesn't have to be perfect. And then I go to my top view and I do the same thing. Again, I'm trying to make this box the correct size to fit all of my sculptural elements inside of it. Now, once you've sized that single cube, don't rotate it or anything like that. Just make sure you're scaling it and moving it, okay? Once you've sized it to the right size to enclose your entire model edge to edge, we're going to pull up a little submenu in Blender with the N key. So I'm going to hit N, shortcut, and this little submenu pops out on my screen. And what I want to do is take note of some of the exact values that are shown for the dimensions option. And these are absolute dimensions measured in Blender. So they give you kind of an accurate sizing idea of how big your model is going to be based on a specific unit structure, whether it's inches, centimeters, or millimeters. If you want to change the way that Blender actually works with measurement systems in here, you can come over here to your properties and go to Scene, which is this little circle and this little cylinder icon in your property panel. And when you go over there, there's a units area, and you can use either metric or imperial to better understand measurement systems inside of Blender. So I'm going to use imperial, which is standard for what we use in the US, because I understand that. So I'm going to use that. And under dimensions, now it tells me the exact sizing of my model currently in 3D space. So it gives it an idea of being like an 18-foot by 14-foot by 43 foot area inside that cube structure. So it's kind of big, right? That's pretty massive. Now it's just good to take note of that. We can choose to at this time if we wanted to actually like take our entire object and scale it down by selecting all the pieces in the outliner panel and then using scale to grab it all. Or you can just maintain the understanding of this scaling option that's here and just keep those numbers handy because you may need those for converting your model in Augment later. All right. Okay, so once you understand that, that's option one for working with this process. Option two is kind of similar. Here, I'll delete this box. The second version of this is selecting all your mesh objects in your scene. And here, I'll add like a couple extras just for the sake of the demo here. So I'll add an extra sphere over here and maybe one down over here. And what you do is you select all of the objects in your scene. So when you're doing that, you can hold down Shift and then click on each one, and they should each highlight an orange color. Darker orange actually indicates child selection to the main object you started with. But that just shows that they're all currently active. Now what we're going to do is actually temporarily duplicate them. So I'm just going to make a copy of my object elements in my scene. So Shift D for duplicate. And then I'm going to pull out the copy. Now remember, when you do Shift D, make sure you're sensitive to wherever your mouse is located, because whatever window your mouse was in, that's whichever direction your mouse will pull your objects, okay? So I was in my top view, so I'm just going to slide this copy out over here to the side. And after we do that, we're going to join all the objects together to make them in Blender at least read like they are one unified form. according to Blender. So to do that, we're going to press the Control J shortcut. And when I did Control J, notice how all the objects actually converted into a single color tone on the surface. That is because now Blender considers them all to be one single form inside the outliner panel. So that's why there's this option down here that says sphere that's highlighted, and there's now no other layers highlighted. So the good news about that is that because it thinks it's one object, if I switch to bounding box, it shows one box for all those objects. So it's the same thing we did a minute ago, but instead we worked with a duplicate that we joined together. So now the dimensions that it reads are listed accordingly over here for all of those objects. And so that's the absolute stretch area for that. 3D printers will use the same information. When you send an object to print, it looks at the absolute dimensions based on a bounding box area that it covers inside of the 3D printing plate. So if it exceeds any specific dimensions, then it can't be printed. It needs to be rescaled. But now we see that, and we know what dimensions we need to convert to or use for our model. So you just need to bear in mind, always work with this on the duplicate, because the moment you make a duplicate of your entire model this way and join it, it's flattened. You can't like disconnect all the pieces unless you do Command Z a few times. All right, I'm going to go ahead and exit back to solid mode, and I'm going to delete my duplicates. All right. So that's just understanding the absolute dimensions of your entire model. All right. Again, at this stage, we don't need things like our camera, our empty object, or our lights, or our cyclorama anymore. All of that stuff does not need to translate out with our export for our model. So for stuff like that, you need to come in and get rid of them. Don't just turn them off, because that doesn't help ignore them for Blender when it exports. It will find this object in your list and make it visible all over again. So I'm just going to select by holding Shift and grab, at least deleting all my object elements. You can leave your camera, the empty, and the lights, but the cyclorama as an exterior object has to go. So we got to delete it. All right. Now, while we're in object mode, we're going to actually reposition and correctly orient the sculpture for our augmented reality viewing. When we're viewing our model for critique, we'll be looking and scanning your print 4-angle image on the wall. The way that you can understand how it views it inside of Blender Space is that your grid plane represents your photographic image that will be on the wall. So you need to imagine that grid plane as though it was a vertical plane for the wall. And so when we think of it that way, we need to make sure that our model appears in front of that grid plane in the right orientation, as though we were looking at it mounted to a vertical wall structure instead of on a floor. So what I'm going to do is actually rotate all of my model elements to face upwards into the sky to suggest the correct orientation for our final export. All right, so while we're in here, again, you can use hit A a couple times to select all your objects. And then we're going to rotate everything to go in the right direction. So I'm going to start in my right side view over here. And I'm going to hit the R key with my mouse in the right side view. I'm going to close this little panel. There we go. So with my mouse in the right side view, I'm going to hit R and rotate my model to where it faces straight up in the right view. And now that it's facing straight up, I'm going to drag my model back down towards the base plane. So in the right view, I want to make it rest right on the green line, or right above it. And I want it to be centered over that line. Okay, so the blue line and the green line, it should be centered over this stuff. And you can look in your top view to make sure you're also centered over your green and your red lines over here. Again, this is the object origin in Blender that we're reading from, where those lines intersect on your grid plane, and that's important that it's lined up with that. All right, once we got it positioned like that, now we need to go through and do some converting of any non-mesh objects in your design. So for instance, if you have added anything to your scene that uses metaballs, for instance, or surfaces or curves, all of those elements, or even text, any of those elements are considered non-mesh objects right now. So here, I'll add like a metaball or two to my scene just to help you see this. So there's one, and there's another one, and another one. Okay, so each of these are non-mesh elements, and I have to convert them into mesh to make them editable or actually viewable inside of augmented reality. And this is also a step you would have to do if you wanted to convert your entire model for like 3D printing. So I'm going to select all of my little metaball structures in this case. So shift and grab each one. And I'm going to use the shortcut Alt-C. That's convert. And it gives me two options on this little menu that it pops up. And I'm going to use the one that says mesh from curve, surface, meta, text, whatever. Once I do that, the object is flattened into actual polygons. And so now it's completely editable. And that's what you need to get any forms that you've created in Blender into. Same thing with curves, same things with the little NURBS surfaces, if you've added any of those to your scene that you're currently using. Usually you can identify them very quickly in your outliner panel because they each have specialized icons. So metaball structures will have like a special metaball icon and so on. But you need to go through and convert each of those into regular objects. All right. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to actually check the polygon count. The bigger your model is, the more room it's taking up, the harder it will be to view it in augmented reality if it has way too much surface detail. I think that the technical limitation in Augment is 1 million polygons, but you don't want to reach that level because you can't really move the model inside of a mobile app accurately. It just kind of jumps or crashes. So I highly recommend that you keep your model on a fairly low end in terms of that particular detail. So I'm going to check my character first, and I'm just going to select them, and I'm going to go to my property panel. And anytime that we need to reduce the polygon count of a specific model item, we can use the modifier called decimate. Decimate is what allows us to reduce the overall count on a particularly selected object. So with that model up, I've got that modifier on, and it tells me how many faces it's currently made of. Again, if this number is high, if this number is over 100,000, it's way too big. You need to drop it down to a much more reasonable amount. I would recommend keeping it probably more around the 70,000 range. For any individual piece of material you're working with in here, should not be huge. So to change it, we just adjust the ratio slider. I usually do it by retyping in over the number to do like a decimal that's less than 1. So I'm going to try like 0.5 and hit return to see what the face count changes to. And my face count is now at 68,000. That's pretty good. It went from like 300 something to 68. So that's what I need. It will update visually. It'll kind of preview update your model. When you do this, go ahead and check this box that says triangulate. You do need to have your model converted into triangles. This is one place that we can do it in while we're working with a shape. But I'll go ahead and hit that and hit apply to save it to my model. So now my model is actually easier to work with. If you're still editing your model, you may want to go ahead and add the decimate tool or modifier to your model and apply it so that you can work with your model more quickly. If your model is still sitting over 100,000 polygons, you need to probably reduce it so you can edit faster on it. Otherwise, it'll slow down your computer. So I reduced it on that. You can check each of your other model structures with the same tool to see if any one of them is exceeding like a high number. The other thing you can do to check the polygon count in your entire scene is it is listed up here across the top navigation bar in Blender. It'll say like faces, vertices, and tries. And whatever number it lists for triangles or faces, that's how many triangles or faces are in your entire scene. And if that number, again, is like super high, like over like 100,000 or over 200, it's a lot. You need to start reducing the quality of your elements in your scene by using that decimate modifier. I recommend to have it like at a maximum of like 150,000 for the entire scene. So just think about that when you're working through that part. Be careful not to oversimplify with this tool. The more that you drop the ratio, the more reduced in quality your model will get. It will try to maintain its form the best it can with the number of polys that you leave behind, though. All right, now that we've done all that, we can actually move into the final step of the process here and export the model. So I'm going to go ahead and go to File, and I'm going to go down to Export. And the format we're going to use for exporting is called Collada. This is a standard Exchange format for modeling. When you get in here, a couple things that you may want to do before you finish out on this export screen. One of them, besides setting like the location of where you want to save your work to, which should be your output folder, you also want to rename your model so that you have something accurate. But over here on the left side menu, there's a section that says Export Collada. Here are some checkboxes that you may want to have clicked on. First off, there's a button that says Apply Modifiers. Please check that box. If you have modifiers active on your object, if you don't flatten them to it in Blender, then you need to do it here. For instance, if you added a decimate modifier and you didn't hit the Apply button in the modifier property, it didn't actually do it when you export it. It just exports the original model without the modifier applied. So I would leave Apply Modifiers checked. You can also come down after that. You can come down below, and if it says texture options, right? So this is important when you've applied textures and colors to your model to make sure that they actually travel with your export. So what you want to do is include UV textures. So you want to make sure that's checked. Include material textures, and you can also use the function for copy. So it'll make a copy of your original JPEG of any of those that you have to go out with your exported model, which you will need to upload into Augment. And then down below where it says Collada options, the box for triangulate should already be checked for you, and you want to leave that on. You don't need to have checked use object instances. And that is pretty much it. Just make sure that you've changed the file name. Hit Export Collada. Right. Now once we got that, always go back to make sure you see what it's exported into your output folder. So here's my Collada file, and here's the texture map that's attached to it. So those two items are now present here, and so it did export correctly. So always watch for what it exports when you send it out, because it will make a copy of all your materials and your model at this stage. All right. I'm going to go ahead and stop this particular video, and then I'm going to talk about uploading it into Augment. All right.